transformed. In the world of art, people find salvation, a voice for pain, and sometimes even glory. But what happens when the thin line between creation and destruction blurs? When a warped mind believes that tragedy is truly a masterpiece and blood is the final pigment? Today, we will step into a chilling story where the victims were not chosen at random, but by their own artworks, confessions of pain that turned them into targets. This is not just a series of murders, but a gruesome exhibition orchestrated by a fanatic who believed he was redefining art through death. The series of events began with the death of a talented painter known for abstract works depicting loneliness and loss. His body was found in his studio, but it was no ordinary crime scene. The studio was transformed into a horrific art installation. The victim's body was placed in the center of a large circle drawn with dried blood, surrounded by torn paintings, and on the wall, a phrase scrawled in the victim's own paint: "Not deep enough." The incident was initially thought to be a crazy murder, perhaps due to personal conflict. However, investigators felt something unusual about the meticulous, almost artistic arrangement. Less than 2 months later, a similar case occurred in another city. The victim was an award-winning writer, famous for gritty literary works about family tragedy and the degradation of the soul. His body was found in his private library, tied to a chair, and surrounded by hundreds of torn book pages scattered across the floor. On his desk, his last manuscript, still open, had been overwritten with dark ink with the words, "Truth needs more suffering." Once again, there were no strange fingerprints or obvious signs of forced entry. What was striking was the thematic similarity between the victim's work and how the scene was staged. The murders continued, targeting prominent figures in the creative world: a composer who created melancholic symphonies about loss, a sculptor whose works depicted mental confinement. Each scene was transformed into an altar of tragedy, reflecting the very content of the victim's work, but magnified to a horrifying degree. Investigators began to recognize a disturbing pattern. All victims shared a common trait. They were established artists whose works deeply explored aspects of human pain, loss, or tragedy. Confusion engulfed law enforcement. Who would do this? What was the motive? There were no signs of robbery, no clear personal animosity towards each victim. Criminal psychologists were called in and quickly realized that these were not ordinary murders. This was a highly symbolic and artistic type of crime, driven by a deeper motive related to conceptions of art and suffering. The perpetrator didn't just kill, he was creating a message, his own work through death and scene staging. Public and artistic pressure grew. Fear crept not only into studios and theaters, but into the soul of every creator. Who would be next? Would revealing one's deepest pains through art be an invitation to death? Suspicion and panic began to turn into a collective obsession. In the thorough investigation of the victim's works, investigators discovered another commonality. Each work, whether painting, literature, or music, was highly praised by a famous but reclusive art critic who often wrote under a mysterious pseudonym. This person always praised the artist's vision, but also emphasized that artistic truth required a level of sacrifice and suffering beyond the limits of imagination. This critic's writings were often controversial, considered too harsh and obsessive. This was the first glimmer of light, a thread connecting seemingly unrelated victims. Investigators began to ask, was the killer inspired by these reviews, or was the critic himself the puppet master behind these tragedies? Suspicion gradually focused on a well-known but mysteriously reclusive figure in the art world, a former art prodigy, now living in seclusion, named Dr. Arthur Sterling. He once had shocking works, but never achieved the peak he craved, and from then on became bitter,
shifting to criticism with an extreme view of art.
The bloody masterpiece. As the murders continued with an artistic brutality and increasingly clear commonalities, all eyes began to turn to Dr. Arthur Sterling, the mysterious art critic with extreme views. Tracking Sterling was not simple. He lived in seclusion, rarely appeared in public, and had his own network of illusions built through his sharp critiques. To understand the killer's motive and methods, the investigative team had to delve deep into the complex world of art and psychology. They assembled a multidisciplinary team, including criminal psychologists, art historians, and behavioral analysts. Their goal was not just to catch a killer, but to decipher a morbid ideology that was transforming death into a form of expression. Investigators spent weeks studying Sterling's reviews, especially those about the victims. They discovered a disturbing pattern. Sterling always praised the depth of pain in these artists' works, but at the same time hinted that it was not enough, not genuine, or lacked ultimate sacrifice. He frequently used phrases like, "True art must be forged in fire," "Truth is only found in the abyss of despair," or "Death is the pinnacle of expression." These words, seemingly philosophical statements, became justifications for criminal acts from the perspective of a killer. They also found that Sterling was once a talented painter with high expectations in the art world. However, his works, despite their depth and masterful technique, never received the recognition he craved. He always felt overshadowed by others, especially artists who could touch the public's emotions more directly. This failure festered within him, turning into contempt for what he considered others' superficial art. As the investigation deepened, police began to uncover Sterling's secret online activities. He participated in underground art forums where he acted as an anonymous mentor, discussing his extreme art philosophy. He did not directly incite violence, but instead instilled the idea of the necessity of ultimate sacrifice to achieve the supreme masterpiece. He believed that an artist was truly great only when they not only conveyed pain through their work, but also became the embodiment of that pain.
To understand Sterling better, the investigative team contacted his former colleagues and those who had worked with him in the art world. They described Sterling as a solitary, brilliant, but extremely arrogant and narcissistic individual. He always demanded absolute perfection from himself and others, and would not tolerate any criticism or failure. The rejection and lack of recognition in his art career created a large crack in his psyche, transforming him from a seeker of beauty into someone obsessed with destruction. Subsequent crime scenes provided more horrifying evidence of Sterling's intentions. A poet was found deceased in a room with hundreds of torn paper fragments from his manuscripts arranged in a giant spiral, symbolizing the mental breakdown he once depicted in his poetry. On the wall, a single line of poetry was written in black ink, the last verse written with the soul. Each of these works was not just a murder, but a morbid recreation of the very ideas the victims had dedicated their lives to expressing. The perpetrator spent hours, perhaps days, staging the scenes. This showed that he was not just a killer, but also a performance artist, someone who wanted the world to see his masterpiece. He didn't need to hide completely. He wanted to be understood and admired by those who could see through his vision. For Sterling, these cases were not crimes, but his greatest works, works that transcended the limits of canvas or paper. Investigators tracked down several individuals who had interacted closely with Sterling on underground art forums. They found that these individuals, although not directly involved in the murders, showed significant changes in their thinking and art, becoming more obsessive, negative, and frequently mentioning the necessity of tragedy to achieve truth. This was evidence that Sterling not only affected victims, but also spread his toxic ideas into the minds of others in the art world. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to reshape an entire philosophy of art through destruction. The twisted mind of a critic. As the clues gradually converged and the curtain on Dr. Arthur Sterling lifted, his portrait emerged not just as a killer, but as a mind deeply obsessed with art and recognition. He was a person who once stood at the peak of talent, but fell into the abyss of failure and bitterness, from which he turned the pain of others into his own horrifying works. To understand Sterling, psychologists had to delve into his past. Sterling was born with a sharp intellect and innate artistic talent. He was considered a child prodigy, a phenomenon in the painting world at a very young age. However, excessive expectations and an obsession with perfection created immense pressure. Although his early works were highly praised by experts, they never achieved the popular fame or eternal recognition he craved. Others, perhaps not superior in talent, but with the ability to touch public emotions more directly, consistently surpassed him. This fostered a simmering envy in Sterling and a deep sense of injustice. He gradually came to believe that the art world was a sham, where genuine pain was not appreciated. He began to develop a morbid art philosophy, that true art must be born from ultimate suffering, and that the greatest artists must be those who have experienced and expressed pain to its fullest extent. From a creative artist, he transitioned into the role of a critic, using his pen to attack what he considered superficial art, while simultaneously glorifying works that expressed despair and tragedy. It was this role as a critic that gave him a new stage, a new power. He no longer had to face the fear of failure in creation, but could determine the value of other works. His narcissistic ego was nourished by his sharp critiques, his extreme views that commanded attention. He began to build a discreet online community where he was the master, sharing morbid philosophies about art and pain. Sterling used his extensive knowledge of art history and human psychology to deliberately choose his victims. He did not seek out random people. He targeted artists who had succeeded in depicting pain, but, in his view, were not enough suffering, not enough genuine. He monitored their lives, meticulously analyzing their works, searching for small details, symbols that he could manipulate to make them part of the final masterpiece. His creation process was meticulously detailed. He would skillfully break into the victim's studio or residence, leaving no trace. He did not commit the crimes hastily. Instead, he took his time to stage the scene, turning it into a gruesome art performance. He used the victim's personal belongings, works, or even their poses to create a message. For example, in the painter's case, using blood to draw a large circle was not just an act of violence, but an addition of color that he believed the artist's work lacked. The phrase, "not deep enough," was not just an insult, but his final critique. Every detail at the scene was meticulously calculated by Sterling to reflect the main theme in the victim's work and simultaneously assert his view of true art. This was how he demonstrated his absolute control not only over lives, but also over the meaning of art. He not only killed the body, but also usurped and distorted the victim's legacy. For Sterling, these cases were the pinnacle of an art career he had never achieved conventionally. He believed these deaths were not tragedies, but enlightenments, moments where art and the truth about pain were perfectly intertwined. He was a narcissist who believed himself to be a misunderstood genius, and the only way for the world to recognize his vision was through these horrifying performances. He had no remorse. He only had an obsession with his work, a masterpiece created from blood and suffering. The hunt in the shadows of knowledge. As Dr. Arthur Sterling's profile gradually became clear, the investigation entered its most challenging phase. This was not just about apprehending a killer, but an intellectual battle with a morbid genius who had turned knowledge and art into tools of destruction. The Special Task Force, comprising veteran detectives and criminal psychology experts, faced an unprecedented challenge: how to capture someone who left no fingerprints, no foreign DNA at the scene, and whose motives lay deep within the complex layers of psychology and art philosophy. The only and most reliable clues were Sterling's reviews and his secret online activities. Data analysts worked tirelessly, tracking every smallest trace, every IP address, every virtual account he had used. They discovered that Sterling not only wrote reviews on public sites, but also maintained several underground art forums, where he was a major influencer, spreading his extreme philosophies. He used highly suggestive language, stimulating debates about sacrifice for art and the value of true tragedy. Psychology experts focused on analyzing Sterling's language. They noticed the repetition of phrases related to imperfection, lack of depth, and the need to go beyond limits. These phrases not only appeared in his reviews, but were also found in the scene works he created after each murder. Clearly, he was executing a deliberate scenario, a project to prove his theory through action. To lure Sterling out, the investigative team devised a bold plan. They decided to organize a secret art exhibition, gathering the works of the deceased victims, and announced that a masked critic would deliver a final assessment of their entire legacy. The exhibition was designed to attract attention in the underground art world, where Sterling often frequented, and was promoted with sophisticated language, hinting at the truth and depth of pain. The goal was to stimulate Sterling's narcissistic ego, making him unable to resist participating to determine the value of these works. Sterling took the bait. He appeared at the exhibition under a discreet disguise, with a suspiciously calm demeanor. He walked slowly among the works, his sharp eyes sweeping over each painting, each piece of music, each sculpture. He seemed to be evaluating not just the artwork, but the pain they represented. Investigators watched his every gesture, every expression, trying to find signs of obsession or instability.
During the critique portion, a speaker planted by the police, a respected art critic, presented an analysis he had meticulously prepared. This analysis not only praised the victim's talent, but also emphasized that their works had reached an absolute depth of pain, that no further sacrifice was needed for them to be perfect. The goal was to directly challenge Sterling's morbid philosophy. This critique touched a raw nerve in Sterling. He, who always believed he was the only one who understood true art, could not accept others determining the value of tragedy. He raised his hand, and with a voice full of authority, yet tinged with frenzy, he began to rebut. He declared that true art demands transcendence, that these masterpieces still lack something, a grand finale. He began to use the exact same words he left as messages at the crime scenes, philosophies about blood and destruction as part of the creative process. While Sterling was enthusiastically presenting his morbid vision of art and death, investigators quietly blocked the exits. When he finished his fervent critique, he was invited to a private gallery to continue the discussion. Sterling, still absorbed in his self-satisfaction, did not resist. He believed he had finally found people who could understand him. But when the door closed, he found himself not in an art gallery, but an interrogation room with cold lights. Investigators presented the evidence, linguistic comparisons, deep psychological analyses, and, most importantly, digital footprints proving he was behind the mysterious reviews and underground forums. Sterling initially remained calm, trying to steer the conversation towards academics, dismissing it as a misunderstanding of abstract art. However, when investigators presented specific details about how he staged the crime scenes, the symbols he used that only the perpetrator would know, his eyes began to change. The self-satisfied smile gradually disappeared, replaced by a cold anger. He had no remorse.
He was angry that his greatest work was being misunderstood and destroyed by mediocre people. He did not see himself as a criminal, but as a misunderstood artist, someone who dared to cross boundaries to achieve an artistic truth that no one else could reach. He was the embodiment of a genius mind consumed by ego, transforming creation into a tool of horror. A legacy of pain and conclusion. The arrest of Dr. Arthur Sterling was a significant turning point, but not an easy end to the tragic series of events. He was imprisoned, but his mind remained immersed in his delusional world of art and pain. Sterling could not be convinced that his actions were criminal. He still believed he was a misunderstood artist, someone who dared to cross boundaries to achieve an artistic truth that no one else could reach. His emotional callousness and unyielding belief in his morbid ideology were terrifying evidence of the depth of his psychological disorder. In court, Sterling showed no remorse. He even tried to turn the witness stand into a stage to interpret his works, using academic language to justify his murders. He argued that the deaths of the victims were the completion of their works, the necessary bass note to achieve a tragic symphony. Psychologists had to work tirelessly to clarify his mental state, distinguishing between a sharp intellect and a mind distorted by pathology. Ultimately, Sterling was convicted, not for insanity, but for intentional criminal acts stemming from an extreme and dangerous psyche. In-depth analysis of the perpetrator's psychology. Dr. Arthur Sterling. Dr. Arthur Sterling is a prime example of the danger when narcissism and a sense of abandonment/failure combine with a transcendent intellect pushed to its limits. Malignant narcissism. Sterling had an inflated ego and an insatiable need for recognition. He believed he was a genius, and when the world didn't recognize him the way he wanted, he sought to force that recognition. He could not tolerate being overshadowed or failing. His transition from artist to critic, then to killer, was a series of behaviors driven by a desire to control and determine value when he couldn't create it himself. Failure complex and envy. His unfulfilled art career sowed deep bitterness within him. Sterling not only envied the success of others, but also despised what he considered superficial works. This envy was not just a negative emotion, but became a motivation for him to punish those he felt had usurped his rightful place. Distorted worldview of art. For Sterling, art was no longer a healthy expression of emotion, but a stage for him to display power and control. He believed that pain and death were essential elements to create true art, transforming personal tragedies into his own masterpieces. This was a psychologization and aestheticization of crime, where he viewed the most brutal acts through the lens of beauty and perfection. Lack of empathy and conscience. As a prominent characteristic of antisocial personality traits, Sterling completely lacked the ability to empathize with the pain of his victims and their families. He did not see them as human beings, but as materials for his work. Conscience did not exist. Every action was justified by a higher artistic purpose. Need for absolute control. Not only controlling his works, Sterling also wanted to control how others perceived and evaluated art. By manipulating crime scenes and leaving artistic messages, he tried to dictate how the public understood his work, demonstrating absolute power over meaning and truth. A legacy of pain and conclusion. Dr. Arthur Sterling's case leaves a cold legacy and haunting questions. It is not just a warning about the danger of a distorted genius mind, but also a mirror reflecting the hidden dark sides within the art field itself. For the art community, this case is a scar. It forces them to confront uncomfortable questions about the boundary between creation and destruction, about the artist's responsibility in exploiting pain, and about where intense passions can lead if not controlled by ethics and humanity. The fear now comes not only from mysterious killers, but also from those once admired for their talent and sensitivity.
Sterling's story is a reminder that beauty and evil can coexist, and sometimes a wounded soul can turn the noblest inspirations into tools of destruction. The depictor of tragedy did not just kill. He transformed death into a gruesome form of art, leaving a legacy of fear and permanent distortion in the minds of those who witnessed his final masterpiece.